This video will analyse the truth behind this meme. How accurate is it? Having read both the Confucian and Daoist canons, I'm in a good position to analyse the truth of both sets of assertions. To start with, Confucius on the left is shown in robes that, if I am to nitpick, and I will, seem more fitted to a more garish time and culture. The robes Confucius would have worn were far more low-key, befitting a man known for his modesty. Also, what on earth are these? Clogs? Confucius would have worn slippers, and with his weak posture facing down, contradicting the upright posture he's always been depicted as holding in art and even in the Analects itself, he is the weak beta male on the left, for he believes that virtue leads to orderly behaviour. It is strange that this is seen as a weak attribute. No hero from history has ever been viewed as lacking virtue, regardless of the historical reality of this virtue. We all know that routines in our life, good habits, and living in moderation tend to build up virtue. We also have all met someone without order in their life. The one who cannot seem to stop drinking, the one who cannot stick to his commitments or their word. We might describe them as fun at best, but never virtuous. We have words like hedonistic or chaotic for someone like this. The writer of this meme is living in a parallel universe where virtue is attributed to the addict. As opposed to this, we have Laozi as the powerful alpha male figure with a large bulbous head meant to show off his off-the-scale IQ. He has a long white beard and carefree flowing hair, adding to the impression of someone who cares not for what other people think of them. Again, as with Confucius, the most garish attire possible has been selected for him. Fluorescent pink and green would have been impossible to attain during Laozi's lifetime, the spring and autumn period in China. Chad meme appreciators would be happy to know that the shirt is imprinted with the characters Ayo on it, which in Chinese tends to mean ouch, as it does in the original English version. And he is riding the oxen yet again, accurately that he's said to have ridden in the legends. As the story goes, Laozi was said to be leaving the civil service and into exile. And at the gate into the wilds, a guard asked him to write down his philosophy, as he was a known sage. The Dao De Jing, or Dao De Jing, was the result of this. The true pronunciation should be Dao De Jing. On his top left, above his powerful arms, it says, "Incarnation of a god." Laozi himself never claimed this. The writer has clearly read Daoist literature, been impressed by it, and there's a lot to say about the Dao De Jing, but to say that he is an incarnation of the god, especially when he didn't claim it himself, is off with the fairies. Although Laozi is a semi-mythical figure, he is said to have lived in the spring and autumn period, and died a mortal life. Sits by the mountains, it says about Laozi, until only mountains remain. This comes from the impression that Daoists are meant to sit and make no action whilst meditating, stemming from the Daoist concept of wu wei, or inaction, or nothingness. And there has been some misunderstanding by people in the West and popular misconceptions about this. Daoists do not advocate for inaction. A certain type of action is advocated for, to being like that of the flow of water. It isn't necessarily about doing nothing, but performing the right action at the right time, seamlessly, with minimal effort. The next statement about this gets more to the point of genuine Taoism. Lives in the moment, it says. Great sports people speak of this so-called flow state, whereby, after having effortfully practiced an action over and over, by the time they are in a competition, they perform the routine with no memory of what they had done, no thoughts, just pure action and being. It's interesting that the opposite state is usually described by athletes who fail. They speak of overthinking something, having something else in their mind, fear of failure. This is the state Laozi wants us to avoid, and the Dao De Jing goes over many examples of how to get into this so-called living in the moment state. It is sometimes misunderstood as advocating for a hedonistic living for the moment type state, in which the only consideration is feeling good in that moment. The irony is that at very few places in the Dao De Jing does it describe feelings of happiness or joy. This is because it is not the point, and this is a childlike misunderstanding, as there's there is much more to Taoism than this. And on the left we go to Confucius, who I've just noted has the character Tian, or heaven, or it's part of the word for day, on his yellow garish clogs. This get-up seems more suited to some kind of Ottoman Empire at the height of its degeneracy, rather than anything anyone would wear in China. He is said to be obsessed by rules and rituals. I'll park the childish perspective of rules and rituals for the moment to say that although Confucius is known as a mild-mannered old sage, in his youth he was a firebrand, reformer who tried to reinstate true monarchic rule over those who would have hid behind the curtains in his home state of Liu. Confucius was a perennialist reformer who looked back on the culture heroes of China's semi-mythical origins with awe. He came close to succeeding in doing this too, although in his later life his main focus became describing and defining what it was to be good. As for rules and rituals, even a moment of introspection would allow one to know that rules are good. As I write these words, I set myself the rule of releasing one video a week on a Friday. It is the childish person who says rules are there to be broken and that we can do without them. One only has to live a life in this manner to know where this leads. As for rituals, every single one of us has them, whether we like it or not, whether we are aware of it or not. As with rules, the question about rituals should be, are they good ones? Confucius was, if anything, passionate about earnest expressions of emotion in rituals, such as funerals, and spoke of the need to be modest in displays of wealth during such ceremonies. He would disapprove of showiness and forced crying that have evolved over time into so-called Neo-Confucianism. On the other hand, Laozi is said to be too alpha to explain himself. Although this made me chuckle, there is some truth and untruth to this. Philosophers, and particularly people trying to explain states of being, have to deal in analogy and example to get their points across. Laozi does just this. So although he does give example and allusion to his main points, he doesn't tell, he shows. Therefore I can understand how this seems to be not explaining himself. Meanwhile, Confucius is said to live in mum's basement as an act of filial piety. The writer of this meme is someone of truly refined humour. The concept of filial piety, or shao, has taken on many additional folk dimensions over 2,000 years since Confucius lived. In reality, it is one of the less referenced concepts in the Analects. Other concepts like Zhuangzi, or superior person, are raised far more frequently and go into detail to describe behavioural and attitudinal patterns that people of this mindset of the Zhuangzi are engaged in. The core of filial piety, shao, was simply that a child should respect their parents to maintain proper relational order. Confucius lost his mother when he was a youngster, so he couldn't have lived in his mum's basement even if he wanted to. Another point is that living with one's parents, with one's wife and children, is a normal state throughout history in many places. It is odd to see that this is being shown as entirely a bad thing. Not that I would advocate for the extreme of living in one's mother's basement. I know how these work. The beta on the left is taken to its extremity and most idiotic articulation possible, whilst the Chad is ridiculously overpowered. This is a hilarious meme, best one I've seen yet. Laozi eats his own Jing. I am going to make no comment on the practicality of such an undertaking. Just like with Confucianism over the subsequent 2,000 years, certain folkish practices have been overlaid onto Taoism, and the Dao De Jing does not go into such things. Confucius apparently secretly envies the freedom of the Shaoren. Now, there might be some projection going on here. Confucius barely mentions the so-called Shaoren, small petty-minded person. The phrase living rent-free in one's head springs to mind here. Certainly Confucius never even thought about them. Laozi is said to have balanced yin and yang. Supposedly, yes, although the first reference to yin and yang, that is light and dark opposites, only occurs in chapter 42 of the Dao De Jing. Confucius is said to be mortal. Well, we are sitting here talking about him 2,500 years after his death. In the same sense that we might deem Laozi to be immortal, surely Confucius is. Laozi, the historical figure, was said to have died a mortal death. The ultimate irony is that Confucius saw himself as following the Tao, or the path, but in governance rather than in retreating to a hermit-like lifestyle. While of Laozi it says, thieves are more virtuous than moral fags. I am unclear of the meaning of this, but it seems to be scoffing at anyone who places importance on having a moral system. Well, I know children who think like this, and adults who've never grown up too. Won't sit on a crooked mat. This is brilliant. Such a specific reference to a verse in chapter 10 of the Analects. Here it is. Since when was perfectionism or conscientiousness necessarily a bad thing? Chapter 10 is a highlight of the Analects, with many insights showing, not telling, what Confucius was like as a man. Laozi is said to get rid of books and knowledge. There is no evidence that Laozi advocated for throwing away books. It was a state of mind and being he wanted to express, and this is the focus of much of the Dao De Jing. He just chose to do it with a hermit lifestyle himself. Confucius did it in governance and saw himself as following Laozi. Of Confucius, he is said to say, "The cautious seldom err." Confucius, in his own life, lived out a bold and courageous plan. This was hardly a man without bravery. However, in his later years, his priorities changed, and he set about recording great swathes of history and articulating his moral vision to his disciples. It is to them we have to thank for the Analects, the collected sayings of Confucius written down by them. And Laozi is said to move effortlessly. Well, I suppose it would seem like that when one rides an oxen, hardly a transport of choice for someone in a hurry. Won't eat wine or dried meat from the marketplace. Another excellent specific reference to a single verse in the Analects. This person really knows his stuff. Who wrote this meme? Internet, do your job. This is a superb meme. Laozi is said to think aesthetics are more important than truth. This is an odd leap, and Laozi makes few references to aesthetics or truth. And he is said to ride a thick water buffalo. I've heard of what this thick means, and it's both what it used to mean and not what it used to mean at the same time. The buffalo is, I agree, thick in the old sense that is granted. Obedient citizen, it says of Confucius. There is no evidence, given what we know of Confucius's own life, of him being an obedient citizen. In what way is trying to take down the prevailing shadow elite of one state being an obedient citizen? The impression of Confucius that influences this comes from the fact that he did promote filial respect in proper relations to one's superiors, parents and siblings. However, more often than not, Confucius describes propriety, li and de, righteousness in relations. This would have been expected by him to be a two-way street, and false leaders hiding their own agendas were certainly unworthy of respect to Confucius, as he showed in his own life. Patriarchal. Confucius makes one mention of male and female in the Analects, a much quoted verse, 1 out of over 800. The vast majority of the verses just simply speak to how it is to be good. Explaining such a modern concept as patriarchal to Confucius himself would have been farcical. Wasn't even gonna write anything, it says about Laozi. According to the legend, this is true. He didn't intend to write anything, and therefore there's no evidence that he wanted to share his perspective with us. Now, wouldn't that have been a shame if we'd never had his writing? I suppose we are to thank the man at the gates who asked him to write it down. Of Confucius, isn't it a pleasure to study and practice what you have learnt? This is a repeated refrain through the Analects. It is odd that this is seen as negative and beta. Heroes from history are born through practice of trial and error and often fail before they succeed. Nobody looks up to someone who refuses to learn. All in all, this meme gets the gist of Laozi with some exaggerations, as it always does in the Chad format. At the same time, it says it has a lack of depth of knowledge about Confucius and only attacks some of the perceptions of him rather than the reality, although there are some exceptionally funny tidbits. So, for accuracy, this meme gets a 2 out of 5, but for humour, this one made me chuckle more than any I've ever seen. This gets a 5 out of 5.